huge salaries, but there was this huge disparity between the people earning these huge salaries and people earning less than minimum wage. So I decided to take the credit union on a journey of focusing back on its roots, which was to provide resources to people who didn't have resources. And even the history we have at my credit union, which was formed in 1933, was people putting their money together to lend it out to other people who didn't have that same opportunity because banks were ignoring them. And that started a whole new journey for us. We rebranded, reinvented the credit union. We went through extensive brand training, empathy training, communication training. And one of the biggest things we did was change our vision and mission and even our name. I'll start with the mission and vision. Our vision is to be Seattle's partner in prosperity. And prosperity to us means something different to every person. And so we decided to place a huge focus on the underbanked, underserved communities. And what I quickly learned was that unless you had representation at the board level of these communities that you wanted to serve, we weren't going to be successful. And to me, one of the most memorable turning points was when I started talking to the board about going into lower credit and what some people perceive as riskier markets and doing auto loans to low-income individuals to compete against used car lots. One of the board members was enthusiastic about it, but only if we put GPS trackers in their cars. And I remember him saying, that way we can just shut their cars off, as soon as they stop paying and repo them. And it shocked me when he said it, because he said it with he was really enthusiastic about it. And that was a turning point for me to understand I need to disconnect, subprime lending, which is where you put these devices in people's cars, from low income, underbanked people who are honest people who are getting taken advantage of by predatory lenders. And the only way to do that, I discovered, was to get people in the boardroom who either had empathy towards those communities or were part of those communities. And that started a huge cycle of change in our board, which took multiple years, and a lot of governance changes. Some of those governance changes included term limits, really bolstering our nominations committee to where they were really screening people, bringing in consultants to talk about succession planning. The regulator stepped in to force succession planning onto the credit union. And it was a rough road, I'd say, for many years to really get that diversity. So I don't want to just continuously talk for 45 minutes. I don't know if I should pause and take questions, or am I on the right track, or?
Sorry, lost my mute button there. Yeah, no, this is great. I know we've got a few folks on the phone that looks like they're muted. If you're on the phone and you want to unmute, it's *6 to ask a question. I know I've had some folks ask how to unmute themselves. Anyone on the actual screen here, we've got a few others that their names are showing up, so they're there on the computer. Have any questions that you want to interject at this point?
This is Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Hey. Hi, Richard. Thank you for being here and sharing your experience. I think the thing, I was the chair of Weaver Street Market many, many years ago, and am now newly in the chair position. I also have, great to see Alana on the call, is also a board member. it's less of a question. Well, it probably is a question. I'm just that the board is rather than being the initiator of the action, for you as the CEO was the one to initiate it and to prompt the board into shifting. And also that it came from, an interest in competing. And I know that from our standpoint, that from a board standpoint, that we're the agent of the owners, and we see ourselves at the front of the train, setting the values and so forth that drives operational to produce a result, right? So it's just an interesting shift for me, and I wonder how your board interacts and who they consider their owners to be.
Linda, that's a great perspective, and you're actually the first person to ever bring this up. I've never really discussed it because in my personal experience at this credit union, I guess without going into too gory details, when I got to the credit union, the board was in total dysfunction. There was, you've heard the term entrenchment. We were the definition of entrenchment. I had several board members who had been on the board for over 30 years. The funniest one was the second CEO of the credit union, and keep in mind we've been around since 1933, served 20 years as a CEO and then 30 years as a board member. So the board was really entrenched into keeping the credit union as traditional as possible. And I remember several people commenting that we were at the time a $500 million credit union with a $100 million board. And the analogy they were using was that the board just did not want to see the credit union change. To me, as the CEO, is a matter of survival. For me, the mission has two different reasons for being. One is that business competitive, how will we survive? And the other one personally for me is how do I give back to the community, and how do we serve the people we were supposed to serve? So it was a battle of the wills. The board did approve the mission and vision of the credit union. It was actually presented by a marketing firm after working pretty intensively with the management team and myself. So it was kind of in reverse because the board was pretty disengaged from what the purpose of the credit union should have been. So I would say that in a normally functioning credit union, the board would have been actively involved in creating the mission and vision with the marketing firm and the management team. That just wasn't the case in my case.
Well, and I acknowledge you for the initiative that you did take, right? Actually going back to the roots of where the credit union was evolving from, as far as providing resources for those who don't have resources. So, and, the interest of that is it's likely not just with the Seattle Credit Union, but organizations, cooperatives, a lot of cooperatives, right? When you have the traditional approach that is a CEO-driven approach, it's all dependent on how great your CEO is as far as the direction of the organization. Whereas, if we think that there's no co-op without owners, there's no board without owners, there's no CEO without a board, who's actually, where does the accountability and responsibility actually lie, such that the values are inherent and captured and embodied with the organization, no matter who's on the board or who the CEO is.
And that's where we are now. The mission took a life of its own. And it gained momentum because it was the right thing. It was hard to argue the mission. It was a challenge to get that current board on board with the mission and vision. And a lot of them just self-selected out. you bring up a great point. The board is responsible to the membership. Today, it's completely reversed of what it was before. Today, my board is extremely supportive and connected to the mission and vision. And I'd say every board member is there only because of the mission and vision, which is the opposite of what it was when I started.
That is so great. That is a great story.
I love what you're saying because it's how I felt. I often told people, and I tell people now, I felt like I was living two lives as a CEO. I had the life in the boardroom where I had to work with the board and try to get the governance implemented and get that infrastructure implemented to be able to make sure that our mission and vision was successful. And then I had this other life with the organization, which was to continue building this mission and vision and rolling it out into the community. And until I got the board in alignment, those were on two separate tracks, which was really unfortunate.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. I am curious, as you'd likely continuing with regards to how, given the topic of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, how you see that playing out, which you might be part of the story that you're sharing.
Sure. So, I'll just continue. So we got to a point where board members started to leave the board. Some were forced off by the regulator. Some were forced off by peer pressure. I think the biggest change was when we brought in a consultant, and she didn't come in to talk about diversity more than she came in to talk about good governance. And within the good governance was just the simple concept of having a diverse board, because it's obviously diverse opinions are a lot more effective than homogenous opinions and perspectives. And I'll never forget, she did this exercise where she, on a whiteboard, created a matrix and solicited from the board, like, what are the important characteristics of a board member? And she just took them from the audience. And we had everything from ethnicity to profession to education, age, I don't even remember. It was a list all the way across one axis, and then she listed the board members down the other axis, and she had board members go up there and check off boxes and created a grid. And that grid showed us black and white where we were lacking on the characteristics that we felt we needed on the board. And I think that day was probably one of the most pivotal days in our history, because it just opened the door to say, wow, our board skews way too high in age. We don't have any representation from younger generations. We have very little diversity from a professional perspective. At the time, we had a majority of either city or ex-city employees on the board. We had very little ethnic diversity. And as a matter of fact, ethnic diversity became a very contentious topic in the boardroom that day. And it became very toxic with the then chair, making, and you've heard this comment before, well, what if we can't find people of color who are qualified to serve on a board? To making jokes of people of color in the boardroom. It was just unbelievable. And that, I think, was the day where things had to change. And so I believe probably over the next several months, one of the things that happened was the board finally created a real nominations committee. For decades, the board had been selecting board members to take over terms and really not having elections. I think when I got there, they had elected, like legally elected, I want to say 2 board members in over decades. In other words, everyone else had been appointed into expiring terms. And the nominating committee, for the first time, started looking at the matrix and intentionally trying to put people in that fit. And one of the big changes that happened was the chair who had made the comment that we weren't going to find people of color. I connected with a local organization that focuses on Latino executives or professionals in Seattle. And they gave me 13 resumes to apply to the board. And out of the 13, 3 of them got on the board. And that's when the tidal wave of change happened. These 3 people were very young. I want to say, well, young is all relative, right? I want to say they were probably in their 30s. Professionals, one worked for Boeing, one was an independent business owner, the other one worked for Microsoft. And all of a sudden we had tech people coming onto our board, and there were people of color, 2 Latinos and 1 African American. And they brought a completely different perspective and energy to the board. And the nominating committee the next year included some of these people on the committee, who were then intentionally choosing diverse candidates. And we went through 3 iterations of board. We went through the highly dysfunctional board to a transitional board that had some dysfunction, some growth pains, what are they, storming, norming, all that kind of stuff, to our current board, which is, to me, fantastic. 100% in alignment with what we're doing. And I think that was probably the biggest, I just abbreviated probably 5 years of transition. But I think it's what's made our credit union very different. Now, at the same time, our credit union itself is very diverse. So, I'm Hispanic, I'm an immigrant. My COO EVP is African American, military vet. Unfortunately and fortunately, she's leaving the organization because she just got promoted to CEO of another credit union. So, I think the fact that we had a diverse management team, or we do, my current chair is in his 40s and Latino, which is just the extreme opposite of the history of our chairs. It's just a completely different credit union. I'll pause there.
Yeah, do we have any other questions coming in? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask if you're on the screen, or like I said, on the phone. We've got some participants on the phone. *6 will unmute the phone.
I could touch while we're waiting, if anyone has comments, please interrupt me if you do. I think the other thing to really point out, and another, I think I call them like historical moments in our credit union, was when the board decided to bring in a formal governance program. And this happened about 3 or 4 years ago, where they hired a consultant to come in and actually implement formal governance in the credit union. And for years while I was there, I remember the first chair for me, the chair when I was hired, always said, no, we have governance, we don't need it. And yet I could never find any governance documents or procedures or anything. And so when we finally, when the board finally decided to bring a governance consultant in, that created a tremendous amount of change and turmoil in the credit union, because that's when a lot of the committees started formalizing with committee charters. We started getting a lot more intentional about our bylaws, our policies, to make sure that we had the right people in the right places and make sure that we were no longer tolerating poor performance on the board. So now they have, they're currently implementing board assessments, 360 reviews within the board. I think this next week are kicking off, they do, it's not really the appropriate term, but personality testing So they use different types of testing just to map where people's communication skills and or not skills, but styles are. And so we can understand who's on the board, how to recruit from that so we can fill in holes. And we've gotten to a point where the board is actually operating at the same level as the credit union does, because the credit union has always had these governance pieces in place. It's just that the board had resisted having these processes in place.
Richard, this is Jeff Harden. I'm curious, the changes that you've made within the board and the governance structure and everything else. Take us back a year ago to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and tell us a little bit about how you feel like all the changes that have evolved over the last several years informed your response to COVID, and how maybe it differentiated you in the marketplace up there.
You know, Jeff, that's a great question. And I'll tell you something that I wouldn't share with my staff, but I'll share with you. I think that if I was under the same governance structure that I was when I first got to the credit union, I probably wouldn't have survived the COVID, or the credit union probably wouldn't have survived the COVID environment that we're in. I got to tell you that, you know, the degree of micromanagement on things like the budget, on implementing technology from the original board was just terrible. When I got there, we were so far behind on technology because the board, because of its city municipal roots, liked managing the credit union on a budget instead of strategy. The newer iterations of the board, including today's board, is the opposite. They manage on strategy. So when COVID hit, we were, you know, in Seattle, we were one of the first cities to get hit. We were in our headquarters. I remember on a Friday, we got a call. We lease a floor in a building, and Facebook leases all the other floors in our building. And it's so funny, a funny story. We get a call from a friend of a friend's who works at our credit union who says, "Did you hear that Facebook evacuated your building a week ago?" And I'm like, oh my God, come to think of it, that's why there's so much parking in the parking structure. It never even struck me because everything that was going on. And it turned out that a Facebook employee had been tested positive and had been visiting our building without telling anyone. And Facebook just left the building, didn't tell the building owner or us or anything that there was an exposure. So on a Friday afternoon, we decided that we were going to shut down the headquarters. And we literally went remote Friday night. And Monday morning, we were 100% remote, removed from the headquarters. And we've been like that since March 9th. So we're coming up on 1 full year, and we have not skipped a beat. Technology-wise, we were prepared for it, ironically, because we were prepared for disaster recovery for snow, for weather. But to answer your question, the board that we have currently, their philosophy is we have one employee, and that's me. They do not get involved in operations at all. Very rare, and it'll usually be more conversational, just out of curiosity, like, hey, how did you handle why were you ready? You know, but they're very strategic focus and hands-off operations. I kept them informed, you know, with the big steps such as, hey, we're evacuating the building. We'll be remote Monday morning. You know, be prepared. We may have some hiccups, and you may get some complaints. But I don't think I under the original board or even the transition board that I would have had the mental capacity to be able to focus on the operations while trying to manage the board. And I think I would have failed, honestly. I'm not trying to be dramatic, but just the level of stress that me and my team were under during that COVID explosion, we didn't have the bandwidth to have to deal with managing the board's expectations. And to my board's credit, they were like, you do what you need to do and let us know what support you need from us. And it was fantastic. It's gotten us to the point where we are seriously considering getting rid of our headquarters and figuring out how to operate either on a smaller footprint or not 100% virtually forever, but some hybrid model of that. I hope that answered your question.
That's awesome, Richard. I love that you were prepared because of snow and not another, natural disaster or something like a pandemic, but that's great. And I'm curious, that it kind of branches away from our topic, but I'm just curious then, right now, being virtual, do your members use the shared branching that the credit unions have? And then, so they're able to go to branches that are open, or are you still staffing in person somewhere?
So I'll answer that, but please remind me to add one more thing to Jeff's question. I think that will be really relevant. So currently, our branches are by appointment only.
Okay.
And a lot of people, a lot of members get upset about that, but I'll give you an example. Just last week, we had a floating employee that floats between two branches test positive, and we had 2 positive cases one at each branch. So we had to close 2 branches down for a week. We only have 9 branches, so it's significant. So we have to be very careful. And what people, who everything from employees to public perception is, why are you being overly cautious? Well, we are just under $1 billion in assets. We have about 160 employees, 9 branches. And my concern, number one, is employee safety. I do not want to be responsible for an employee, dying because they had to come to work. That to me is unacceptable. The second part is the size of our operations. We don't have the luxury of having a whole department go out sick. So if, for instance, our accounting department has a COVID breakout, that would knock out a significant part of our operation. So it was really important for us to remain remote until I think the next step is until vaccines really become pervasive in our community. But jumping back to Jeff, the governance and the highly functioning board that I have, and even the previous iteration of them allowing us to do what we needed to do and basing things on strategy, allowed us to build our technology to be able to support being remote. So I bring that up to the current board. I'm like, thank you for allowing us, indulging us into, allowing us to go into the technology that we needed. For instance, everyone had a laptop. We were ready to go. A lot of credit unions I talked to, they didn't have the equipment because it was too expensive. For us, it was non-negotiable to shut down. We couldn't just shut down our operations. So, but I attribute that to good governance because the board allowed us to really focus on the disaster recovery that we felt that we needed to run the organization with.
That's awesome. I love that. I'm going to open it up for any other final question to come up from anyone. And again, if you're on the phone, we've got *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, Emily and Richard. This is Linda again. I was wanting to leave it open for somebody else.
No, go ahead, Linda.
So maybe this might be appropriate, kind of circling back on the topic from which you started. So I can hear the real shift in ethnic diversity on the board. I don't know whether you actually look to see whether that's a match for the diversity of the ownership of the credit union. Is there anything else that intentionally, either operationally or at the board level, of taking that to a whole different depth? So it's not just ethnic diversity on the board and the varying diverse opinion that comes with that, but actually imbuing an entire upheaval of any kind of bias that would be subtle and in the way of what are you ultimately wanting people left with as a result of who you are as a credit union.
Yes, you know, Linda, I'd love to have you on my board. So, yes, it's we take DEI very seriously at our organization. We have an AVP of DEI and a VP of Strategic Partnerships and DEI at our organization. We are this year focused on implementing the real deep work, which is everything from scrubbing resumes from names and addresses and such. So we try to take the bias triggers that are in resumes for employment. My desire is to propose that for the board also. The only issue is that we do have to be intentional about who we're recruiting. What I love about my board right now is my nominating committee. We have our elections or our annual meeting coming up in April. My nominating committee chose to leave seats empty because they felt that they didn't find the right people to fit the diversity requirement for the board. I've never would have imagined that just 3 years ago. And they were adamant. They're like, we have, this person could probably do the job well, but then we would fill a seat and we would not be able to bring in a diverse person. So let's hold the seat open and we will continuously recruit through the year, was what they decided. The representation of our membership, I guess I look at it as representation of the community. We're a community credit union. So we're community chartered for the state of Washington. Our demographics in Washington are predominantly Caucasian. I think 38% of the population of Washington is minority. So people might say, well, then, should that be the mix of your board? I say no. And the reason I say no is because the hard work really comes in representing the underserved communities. Those are the communities that require special products, special, credit, more risk or different risk. And that's where you really need the empathy on the board to understand those types of challenges. So representing membership versus representing community, I think, is a really interesting balance. That's really good food for thought. I like that.
It's an interesting difference between, you have an ownership that might not. There's what kind of impact they see that being part of a cooperative and a credit union is going to have on the entire community. So then you have the beneficiaries,
yes,
who are and the diversity of the beneficiaries, as well as the owners actually being connected to and aligned with that is indeed what is going to serve their intent in being an owner.
Yes, and that's an interesting. That is something we've contended with. I have to say that the majority, and it probably has to do with Seattle. Seattle is a very cooperative, friendly city or community, if you will. We have a lot of cooperatives here. So the fact that people who bank with us typically are cooperative friendly and have a mindset of the cooperative principles and make I think, embrace it. When we started shifting our focus to, and let me make something clear, we serve everyone. So we serve the Amazon employee, the Microsoft employee, we'll serve Bill Gates. We don't only serve certain segments of the community. The reason we talk about underserved, underbanked so much is because it's the hardest part of our strategy. And it's the one that takes the most amount of focus and energy. But we did have members who, I'll never forget comments that I saw on social media and even emails I received that said, I don't want my money helping those people, meaning low income people or people of color. And my board was in total agreement. This probably was no longer the place that those people should bank at, because it just wasn't in line with our mission and vision of the credit union. So It did take a reinvention of the credit union, and in some ways, we did have to break away from our more conservative roots. But I got to say, you know, me hearing from a dozen people, we have we have over 50,000 members. So if you told me 1,000, 2,000 members were up in arms over the changes, and I'd say, okay, we have some work to do. But the number of people who complained was literally in the, I'd say maybe 1 or 2 dozen that actually verbally filed a complaint.
I think that's the proverbial 20 or 24 in every co-op, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Those are the ones who are not going to like anything that goes on. Well,
Exactly.
thank you. I appreciate your story, and thanks for indulging me without camera. It wouldn't be safe for me to have it on with where I'm located. So anyway, thank you.
Sure thing.
Thanks, Linda. And any closing remarks from you, Richard? We're coming up on time, and I want to be respectful of everybody's lunch hour here and your morning coffee hour, Richard. But any closing remarks that you can kind of send us off with?
No, you know, if you have non-credit union people on here, right? Okay.
Yeah.
For those of you who are with credit unions, there's an article coming out in Q's that I'm authoring that talks about this, actually talks about board renewal and disconnecting low-income people from subprime. In other words, they're not the same, disconnecting that thought. But, you know, for me, this is more of a personal thing. You know, I am an immigrant. I grew up low income. English is my second language. I just was fortunate enough to come here when I was 4, so I was educated here, which is why I don't have an accent. But for me, it's about giving back to the community. I mean, I feel very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in. And so to me, I want my legacy to be that I've made a change to the community. I impacted people's lives. And I hope, and I know that, I'll leave you with this thought. When I started at the credit union, since I've started, I go into every new employee orientation classroom. So I speak for 30 minutes. I meet all the new employees. When I started 9 years ago, the common theme I'd ask, why are you here? Why did you come to Seattle Credit Union? And the common theme, and I'm not joking, was the bus stop was in front of the credit union headquarters. It was easy to get to. You have good benefits. I needed a job, whatever. It was always these non-mission reasons. Today, when I go to a new employee orientation, I'd say 80% of the staff that's in that room are there literally because of my mission and vision. Not mine, but the credit unions. They're there because they've seen us in the community. They've heard of what we do in the community. They want to be a part of what we do in the community, and that's why they're there. And to me, that's the biggest sign, one of the biggest signs of success, that we're doing the right thing. People are there for our mission and vision. Same with the board. I'd say 90% of our board members are there because they love our mission and vision. They're not there for resume power. They're not there for self-interest, which is what it was originally. They're there because they want to see us further the mission and support the credit union. So I think when you start measuring that engagement is when you start seeing whether or not you're being successful from that representation, mission alignment, all that kind of that thought process.
I love that. It all goes back to the mission and vision.
It does. It really does.
You know, the cooperative way, it's really about driving those principles, living those principles, and understanding why we're here, our mission and vision. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone else, thank you for your questions and your involvement. Those on the phone, thanks so much for joining us. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.